Okay, so this video I want to compare Linux Mint with Ubuntu and help you decide whether one of these two is really the best distro for you in 2024. So if you want to find out more, please let me explain. Now, before we get cracking, I need to point out that I'm kind of working on the assumption that you're a bit familiar with what Linux is. Maybe you've watched my video that I published recently about the best Linux distros for 2024, so you kind of know what's out there. And I'm kind of assuming you know what Ubuntu is. You may not be familiar with Linux Mint, but Ubuntu has been around for so long and really is such a popular distro that I'm kind of guessing that you know what it is. So this is really going to look at the differences between Linux Mint and Ubuntu, assuming you know what's already in Ubuntu. If you don't, as I said, do check out my other Linux-based videos here on this channel. So really the question is Linux Mint a better version of Ubuntu than Ubuntu itself? Why am I saying that? Because Linux Mint is based on Debian and Ubuntu. Of course, Ubuntu is based on Debian, so you kind of get the history of Debian and Ubuntu, and then you've got Linux Mint, which is built on top of those. Now, Linux Mint versions are tied to Ubuntu long-term support releases. So Linux Mint 20.0 through to 20.3 were based on Ubuntu 20.04. Linux Mint 21.x is based on Ubuntu 22.04 long-term support, and now Linux Mint 22.x is based on Ubuntu 24.04 long-term support. So you're not getting lots and lots of versions every week, something new, something different, a rolling update. There are other Linux distros for that. This one you're going to get not so frequent version updates. Of course, you are getting the security updates and the bug fixes, but not new versions. Only much less, but you're getting long-term support with those. So for example, Linux Mint 22, which has just come out, will be supported until 2029. Now, Linux Mint comes in 3 flavors: Cinnamon, Xfce, and Mate. And there's also a Debian only edition, and we'll just quickly look at that now. So the Cinnamon edition is the most popular version of Linux Mint. It uses the Cinnamon desktop, which was primarily designed for Linux Mint itself. It's sleek, beautiful, and full of new features. That's the marketing bump for you there. Now, the Xfce edition. Xfce, of course, is a lightweight desktop, so better for machines that don't have quite so many resources. It doesn't support as many features as Cinnamon, but it's lighter on those resources, which means certainly can be good for older PCs, or if you even have a modern PC and you want very, very little of it used up by the desktop and lots of RAM and CPU available for everything else you're going to do it, you can have the Xfce edition. And then the Mate edition is the classic desktop environment that they used to have with Linux Mint between 2006 and 2011, based on GNOME 2. They still support that, and there are new versions of the Mate desktop coming out, and so you can pick which one of those 3 that you want. I say the Cinnamon edition is really kind of the default one. Now, there's also the LMDE project. LMDE is Linux Mint Debian edition. Now, its goal is to ensure that Linux Mint is still able to deliver the same user experience even if Ubuntu suddenly disappeared. Because obviously this is built on Ubuntu, which is provided by a commercial operation. Canonical is the commercial operation behind that. So if that suddenly disappeared for whatever reason, and it probably won't, but if that did, they've still proven they can build the same technology further on. So LMD aims to be as similar as possible to Linux Mint without the Ubuntu part. And all the base packages come from Debian itself. So if you want to kind of go down a better version of Debian than Debian rather than a better version of Ubuntu, then maybe this would be the way you'd like to go. I've just said that there are those 3-4 different flavors of Linux Mint. When you say, Gary, there are also many flavors of Ubuntu, and that's true. There are lots of official flavors of Ubuntu. The one for education, the one with KDE built in, the one using LXQT desktop, the one using the Budgie desktop. And look here, you can have one with the Cinnamon desktop, just the same as Linux Mint. There's one specially aimed at Chinese users. There's another one with the Ubuntu Mate. It's got the same desktop as the Linux Mint Mate edition. It's got the Mate desktop on it. And there's one for content creators. There's one using the Unity 7 desktop. There's one using Xfce desktop. So it's the same as the Linux Mint Xfce version. So in fact, if you look at those, all of the Linux Mint versions are also available as official Ubuntu respins. So Ubuntu kind of has you covered if you really did want a particular type of desktop and you see that's what you get with Linux Mint. Well, Ubuntu also have you covered there as well. So why use Linux Mint if you can get all the same flavors on Ubuntu? Well, the first thing to say is that the default version, the Cinnamon version, is easier. So if you look at that right-hand picture, it does look similar to what the classic desktop environment is, going back to Windows for many, many years, Mac OS even. You kind of, the bottom is where your start menu is. You click on there, you get a menu and you can go through it. The default desktop for Ubuntu is this different one where you've got everything on the side. Now, it's actually pretty easy to use, and of course you could download a flavor, but the default one, it'd be more easier for people coming from a Windows or a Mac background to get used to. Of course, there are other Linux distros that try to emulate the Windows kind of look and feel to the extreme, but just as a general kind of language for design language, the Cinnamon desktop is certainly a bit easier to get used to. And then there's this big question about the packages. Now, without going into it too much, Ubuntu has opted to move to the Snap package format system, while Linux Mint uses Flatpak. And there are a whole bunch of different discussions around which is better, which is a better option in terms of performance, which is better in terms of the open source community. And they're both open source packages, both open source formats. However, the Ubuntu people, Canonical, they are responsible for the infrastructure for providing snaps, whereas Flatpak is more of an open source and a distributed system. There are people that say things about the performance maybe. So some people kind of like one or the other, some people don't really care. But if you are into that, this is one of the things you need to know. Now, Ubuntu has its App Center, which has just been rewritten, by the way, using Flutter for the latest version of Ubuntu. Linux Mint doesn't borrow the Ubuntu software center, its App Center. It's got its own one called the Software Manager, built around Flatpaks. And one of the new things recently in Linux Mint is that verified Flatpaks now show their maintainers' names. This is good to make sure you're not just using an unverified, unmaintained Flatpak for something you don't know what you're installing. That can be a security issue and so on. So that's one of the things. If you are worried about where the software packages come from, what format they're in, then Snap and Flatpak. If you're into Flatpak and you don't like the Ubuntu App Center, then Linux Mint is really the way to go. Now, there is the Canonical Factor, this company that it supports and sort of funds Ubuntu, making Ubuntu in that sense a commercial thing. They need people to sign contracts with them, big businesses to sign contracts with them to provide what they need, and that's fine. They make money. They also provide a lot of services to the Linux community, big contributor, absolutely all fine, but some people don't like the fact that if Canonical make a decision about something like the move to Snap, then you either swallow it and take it or you move on, whereas Linux Mint is community driven, which means maybe there's more freedom. The community gets to decide. Of course, the community deciding has not always been right. There's been other controversies in the past, just across Linux in general, that just because the community decides it doesn't mean it's right. But there you go. But Canonical will always have more resources than the community. So that's another thing to remember. There is a lot to be said for having a commercial entity at the back end of all this stuff, because the level of support, the resources that are available are going to be different to just a community-driven project where you're relying on people giving their free time, where you're relying on people doing this because that's what they like to do. So why would you use Ubuntu rather than Linux Mint? I mean, Linux Mint sounds pretty good, and it's very popular. Well, of course, you have to remember that it's downstream from Ubuntu. Ubuntu is upstream, which means Linux Mint depends on what happens up in the Ubuntu world for it to happen in the Linux Mint world. So often some of the fixes and things that happen first in Ubuntu, and then they trickle down into Linux Mint. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, and I'm sure there are occasions when Linux Mint tries to expedite things and just puts in fixes themselves as quick as they can. But remember, you are always going to get that first level of support if you're a Ubuntu user rather than a Linux Mint user. Now, maybe that speed, maybe in some cases, maybe just about hours difference, may not bother you. You don't care. But it's just something to be aware of. Now, I use many of my PCs, both Windows and Linux, remotely, which means I'm not plugged in here to 7 machines at my desktop. I have different machines that I connect to, and I like to do that using remote desktop sharing. Windows makes that very easy. Now, Ubuntu makes that very easy, as I showed in my recent Ubuntu 22.04 videos, including on the Raspberry Pi. You can connect using remote desktop protocol very easily, and you've got that desktop sharing working. I couldn't find a way to do that with Linux Mint without going through quite a few steps to install desktop sharing, separate packages, and then configure it and so on. Ubuntu is just there. You go into the control, into the settings, and you say yes, enable that, and it all just works. Also, Ubuntu 22.04, if you sign up for a Pro account, which is free, Ubuntu Pro, you're going to get 12 years of security maintenance. So if you really are looking for long-term support, then Ubuntu is the way to go. Okay, so that's it. My name's Gary Sims. This is Gary Explains. Love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Are you an Ubuntu fan? Are you a Linux Mint fan? Or are you going to tell me that you use Arch Linux, by the way? Whatever it is, do let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoy these kind of videos, then why not stick around by subscribing to the channel? Okay, that's it. I'll see you in the next one.